The Great Siege of Malta, 1565, one of the most iconic events in the history of the Mediterranean. More recently, during the Second World War, there was another well-known siege of the strategically located archipelago. However, there is another notable siege of Malta, which took place during another tumultuous period in history, the Wars of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. In 1798, the Maltese archipelago was ruled by the chivalric order of the Knights Hospitaller. Meanwhile, in France, Napoleon Bonaparte was not yet head of state, but was well on his way after a series of military victories in Italy, winning for France the War of the First Coalition. At this point, Napoleon answered to the cabinet back in Paris, known as the Directory. This was a more classicalist leadership of the new republic, which had replaced the short-lived social revolutionaries who had brought the country to terror. On campaign, Napoleon had also become a political player, unilaterally reorganizing northern and central Italy into a series of puppet republics. Now, with France's borders in Europe no longer under direct threat, Napoleon embarked on an ambitious campaign to conquer Egypt. But to do this, he would need to evade the prowling British Royal Navy, which would doubtlessly be hunting them under the command of the legendary Admiral Horatio Nelson. For success, Napoleon would need to open or find at least one friendly port in the Mediterranean. The perfect spot appeared to be Valletta, Malta's relatively new and heavily fortified capital. The rule of the Knights, almost all of whom were foreigners, and whose lowest-ranking members still held command over even the highest-ranked Maltese nobility, had become increasingly unpopular on the island. Supposedly, word of this reality leaked from the office of Ferdinand von Hompesch, the Order's Grand Master. For the past half-decade, the Order had also started to go bankrupt. It was dependent on the incomes generated by the large estates held by many of its knights, over half of whom were French, meaning they had been subject to confiscation at the height of the French Revolutionary Terror. Despite the fact that a more classical government was now in control in Paris, these landholdings had not been returned. On June 6th, the first French ships began to appear on the horizon. The Order began formulating battle plans, but it had been years since the Order had actually been required to fight. The one advantage they had were Malta's heavy fortifications. On the 9th, Bonaparte moved his transports into position for an invasion of the island's main ports, as well as ports on the northern island of Gozo. Before taking further action, however, he sent a peace envoy, requesting that Maltese harbors be voluntarily opened to French ships. Grand Master Hompesch, however, determined that based on treaty obligations, the Order was only allowed to offer refuge for 4 ships. This was unacceptable to Bonaparte, who needed refuge for his entire fleet. The next morning, he sent an ultimatum to the Order, casually mentioning how overwhelming his forces were, and also appealing to the Maltese population by promising to respect their religion, customs, and property, though the same was not promised to the Knights. Without a response, the French landings began the same day. Although the Order offered some resistance, the French had taken control of the main ports with relative ease by midday, though for the moment avoiding the heavily fortified Maltese capital of Valletta. A counterattack by the Order had a glimmer of success before ending in disaster due to a French ambush. The remaining defenders outside the capital now retreated to the old walled city of Medina, the island's former capital. However, by noontime, they viewed further resistance as futile and surrendered the city to the French. Meanwhile, the French had captured the fortresses on the northern island of Gozo without much contest. A siege now commenced on the heavily fortified bastions of Valletta. Panic ran through the city, with the Order and much of its population devolving into factionalism and suspicion. This paranoia led to the murder of 2 Frenchmen living in the city, while 2 of the Order's knights were murdered by the Maltese locals. Eventually, the next morning, negotiations commenced. Napoleon dispatched an envoy to the capital, and a temporary ceasefire was quickly agreed upon. Meanwhile, negotiations would continue aboard Napoleon's flagship, L'Orient, with Napoleon now personally involved. The agreement that was signed saw the Order's military forces stand down and officially transfer sovereignty to the French. Napoleon promised Grand Master Hompesch that he would grant the knights a pension and acquire for them a new principality. This never actually happened, and the order was instead granted asylum in the Russian Empire, later ending up in Rome and continuing to exist as a sovereign entity to the present day, and is a United Nations observer state despite no longer possessing any territory outside of its embassies. To the Maltese, Napoleon promised to respect private property rights, as well as Maltese customs and traditions. The next day, Napoleon disembarked on the island. Bonaparte took up residence in the Palazzo Parisio in Valletta, staying there for 6 nights, taking the week to reform the administration of Malta, before spending his final night in the municipal palace, the Palazzo della Città. Bonaparte and his navy, along with the majority of his troops, then departed for Egypt. He left behind a garrison of 4,000 men, commanded by Malta's new military governor, General Vaubois. The reforms included making all Maltese French citizens and the setting up of Malta's own 5-person directory, comprised of locals and based on the French model. Maltese nobles who had been hoping to gain their authority back now that the knights were gone, were instead stripped of their rank and the nobility was abolished. Freedom of speech and of the press were guaranteed in writing. In reality, only the French-backed state newspaper of Malta was available. All properties belonging to the Catholic Church were confiscated by the French government. The French also imposed high taxes, and in an effort to fund the war in Egypt, began to strip important buildings, including religious ones, of their valuables. Meanwhile, in Egypt, things began to turn sour. Napoleon had conquered most of the country, but in August his navy was decisively defeated by Admiral Nelson and the British, losing 11 ships, including the flagship L'Orient, in the Battle of the Nile. This made Napoleon's hold on Egypt and Malta increasingly tenuous. France's continued actions in Malta did not help their cause. The spark that ignited a fire took place on September 2nd, when the French authorities held an auction for church property that had been seized. The built-up anger over several months boiled over into a general uprising against the French. The rebels, led by Emanuele Vitale and the clergyman Francesco Caruana, quickly grew into a force 10,000 strong. The French were quickly forced to take refuge in fortified strongholds, including Medina and Valletta, with most of the countryside coming under control of the rebels. By September 4th, they controlled the entire island aside from the fortress city of Valletta. The rebels declared their forces to be the Battalions of the National Congress, setting up a Maltese provisional government in the areas they controlled. They also declared that Malta would revert to the status of a fief of the Sicilian Kingdom of Naples under King Ferdinand of Bourbon. Meanwhile, the northern island of Gozo experienced its own uprising, which on the 18th would become led by Gozitan priest Severio Casser. Within a couple of weeks, a Portuguese-led fleet arrived to assist the rebels, with the main force consisting of 5 Portuguese, along with 2 British ships, as well as several other Portuguese auxiliaries. However, the fleet did not stay long, as they embarked for Egypt to assist Admiral Nelson, who would end up sending them right back to Malta to set up a blockade. A few days later, a flotilla of Nelson's battered ships were returning from the Battle of the Nile and attempted to seek refuge in Malta. As the ships were too badly damaged to participate in a siege of the city, the contingent's commander, Sir James Saumarez, sent offers of a truce to General Vaubois and the French administration in Valletta. This proposal was bluntly shot down, and with the British ships needing to reach port for repairs, Saumarez quickly abandoned the idea and sailed for Gibraltar. Before they left, however, the British provided 1,200 muskets to the Maltese rebels. As the month ended, the French did receive some limited naval reinforcement, most notably the warship Guillaume Tell, and also had taken over the small Maltese navy in the harbor of Valletta. By October 12th, the Portuguese-led fleet was back, and the full blockade and siege of Valletta began in earnest. That day, 3 more British ships arrived, tightening the noose, while on the 24th, Admiral Nelson himself arrived aboard HMS Vanguard. Meanwhile, Admiral Nelson dispatched one of his commanders, Sir Alexander Ball, to assist the forces of Casser in the north on Gozo. He negotiated with the French forces garrisoning the Cittadella in Rabat, as well as Fort Chambray on the coast. On the 28th, they agreed to surrender not to the rebels but to the British, with a total of 217 men surrendering 24 cannon, large ammunition stocks, as well as 3,200 sacks of much-needed flour. The population of the entire archipelago was facing a food crisis, as were the French on the island, and to a lesser extent the British and Portuguese in the area. In this case, the British gave the captured stocks over to the local population in Gozo. The next day, the British transferred control of Gozo over to Kasser and the Gozitan rebels, who subsequently declared the independence of the Gozitan nation. Like the rebels in Malta, they declared the state to be a fief of the Sicilian Kingdom of Naples, hoisting the banner of King Ferdinand. Kasser became Gozo's governor-general. All attention then focused back on Valletta. With a full siege now in effect, the Maltese ground forces had been reduced to 1,500, mainly due to the continuing supply problems, and were now supplemented by 500 British and Portuguese Marines. The British tried to enlist King Ferdinand of Sicily and Naples, the now nominal suzerain of Gozo and Malta, to assist with resupply. However, he was unable to, as the mainland continued to battle its own chronic food shortages, before then having to deal with a French-backed Republican uprising, so help from mainland Italy was not coming anytime soon. By the next year, a second coalition had been assembled to fight this new war against France, which at this point was mainly focused on the Mediterranean theater. The Allies tied down the French on the periphery of the Mediterranean, with the action in Egypt, Italy, Corfu, and Minorca taking priority for the French over rescuing their isolated garrison in Malta. The French also successfully ran the blockade several times in 1799, usually as the British and Portuguese exchanged out their ships, and so were able to provide limited resupply to the garrison. This was not nearly enough, and by the end of the year the French had expelled the civilian population of Valletta, aside from workers essential to the French military, with nearly 40,000 expelled from the city, entering the countryside as refugees. Nelson had arranged for Ball to become the head of the Maltese National Congress, essentially becoming Nelson's liaison to the leaders on the ground such as Vitali and Caruana. Nelson himself was no longer with the fleet, but instead had taken up residence at Palermo in Sicily, where he was known to indulge in the finer parts of court life. On November 1st, Nelson offered terms of surrender to the French, but Vaubois again refused. In January, news arrived that upon Napoleon's return to France, he had launched a coup, dismantled the Directory, and named himself First Consul of the Republic, effectively head of state and government. With the situation in mainland Italy now back under control, King Ferdinand finally agreed to provide 1,200 troops to the blockade. These were accompanied ceremonially to the island by the Vice Admiral Lord Keith, as well as Admiral Nelson. While there, Keith ordered Nelson to end his late-night escapades and not to return to the court at Palermo, an order Nelson ignored. Before that, however, the first of the convoy battles broke out. The French convoy of men and supplies was led by the ship of the line Jeannereau, which was quickly damaged by HMS Success and then pursued by Nelson himself, forcing Admiral Jean-Baptiste Perret to surrender, with none of the supplies or men reaching the French garrison. Nelson and Keith then departed, leaving Ball in charge on land and Thomas Trowbridge in control of the fleet. On March 31st, the Guillaume Tell attempted to break out of Valletta harbor. However, the HMS Lion pursued it, along with the HMS Penelope. In the ensuing battle, more than 200 French sailors were killed and wounded, and after all the ship's masts had been shot down, Admiral Decrès was forced to reluctantly surrender. However, back in Valletta, Vaubois continued to refuse to give up. Over the next few months, French supplies continued to dwindle, while on the British side, more trivial matters such as Nelson's continued courtly intrigues grabbed the majority of attention. By September 3rd, the situation for the French had become catastrophic, with over 100 men per day dying of starvation or disease. Vaubois called a meeting of his commanders. They unanimously decided to surrender. So on September 4th, 1800, 2 years to the day after the French had first retreated into the walled city, the garrison at Valletta surrendered, although to the British, not to the rebels. Under the terms, Malta would remain nominally a fief of the Sicilian king, but would now become a British protectorate. The French were permitted to leave with full military honors, while Ball, after leading the rebels for 2 years as the head of the Maltese National Congress, was made the territory's British Civil Commissioner. For his contributions, Ball was later honored by the Maltese people with a large monument, which was funded solely by the donations of grateful locals and which stands to this day. On Gozo, meanwhile, Kasser had continued to operate independently, but in August 1801, Kasser was removed from his post and was replaced by Vitali, coming over from the main island. Gozo was folded into the Malta Protectorate, although it did retain its newly found ecclesiastical independence through the Diocese of Gozo, which continues to exist to the present. At the end of their war with the French, the British would end up promising to return Malta to Naples within 2 years. However, with neither side honoring the terms of the treaty, this never came to fruition. Subsequently, in 1813, as Britain was anticipating its final victory over Napoleon, Malta was given its own constitution and was officially transformed into a British crown colony. Following the aforementioned trials and tribulations of the Second World War, the country initially attempted to join Britain proper alongside the main constituent countries of the British Isles, but eventually opted for independence instead, which was granted on September 21st, 1964. Just over a decade later, in 1974, Malta became a republic, which to the present day remains in control of the strategically located Mediterranean archipelago. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button and leave a comment for the algorithm. For more content like this, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell button so you don't miss the next video. Be sure to check out the project that forms the basis for these videos at apoliticalworldmap.org. And if you can, please sign up for our Patreon to keep the videos coming. For now, thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.